Right, 13 years of war in Syria have killed more than 350,000 people, displaced millions and torn the country apart. Let's take a look at some of the key turning points in the conflict. It all began with peaceful protests in Damascus and Daraa. The Assad government's violent response led to an armed uprising. The conflict intensified with the Battle of Aleppo. Opposition forces captured large parts of the city. The Syrian army recaptured it just 4 years later. Well, in 2013, a chemical weapons attack in eastern Ghouta killed hundreds of civilians. It prompted international condemnation and led to Syria agreeing to destroy its chemical weapons stockpile. Well, ISIL declared a caliphate across Syria and Iraq after capturing large swathes of the country. Raqqa became their de facto capital in Syria. Their reign lasted until 2019. Well, Russia then began direct military intervention in support of Assad. Russian airstrikes helped turn the tide in favor of Assad's government forces. The United States then got involved, launching missile strikes against government targets in response to a chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhoun. The conflict has largely become a frozen one over the past 4 years, until armed groups launched an operation last week from Idlib. Let's bring in Joshua Landis. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He joins us from Oklahoma City. Joshua, I know you've been waiting patiently as we've been talking to our guests and reporters from Syria. All right, so let's just wrap things up in terms of your perspective. Opposition fighters are now in Damascus. Reports even that President Bashar al-Assad himself has fled the country. The situation still remains fluid. A lot of it's still unclear. Whatever the case, though, the rebel offensive, extremely rapid. How did it happen so quickly?
Well, the Syrian army really just melted. There was no money in Damascus to pay troops. People were exhausted. There had not been a peace dividend. Nobody could rebuild their lives. Life looked very grim under this regime going out into the future. We have to remember that there were very heavy sanctions on the regime. America has most of Syria's oil and gas, which it uses to pay the Kurds in the northeast to police the northeast. And so the regime really had no money. And then, of course, Israel's extraordinary attack, which pummeled Hezbollah, pinned back Iran, and has really degraded the Syrian army over the last year, with about 3 strikes every week on the Syrian army, taking out military factories and Iranian militias and Iranian officers. So this is a very weakened regime with no allies, and the army melted away. And that is the real story, the extraordinary story here of very little opposition to a rebel group which has rebuilt itself and shown extraordinary ability to adjust and make adjustments and change itself in order to rally the country behind it.
And Joshua, what about the Syrian president? I mean, there were no real options open to him than to flee the country. What sort of calculations was he making then?
Well, that's something we don't know. And I think many of his loyalists are wondering where he's been, because he's been AWOL. He was in Russia, he came back for a day or two, but now he seems to have fled the country again and made the determination that it's not worth fighting for. And now the question is, how peaceful can this transition be? Because I think everybody is fearful that there'll be something like Baghdad after the United States destroyed the Iraqi government, and we saw all the ministries pillaged and then burnt. People stole even the copper wiring out of the buildings and all the fixtures, the chairs, you name it. And that could happen in Damascus. It's happened in many places before, not only New York City in the 70s when the lights went out. It could happen in places in Syria. And I think that the new government, the new leaders of Syria, al-Jolani in particular, are fearful that this kind of sloppy transition could take place, and it will be very hard to rebuild the country. And he's going to have to turn around and ask the United States to lift sanctions, give back the oil and gas, and turn to Europe as well and say, you have to lift sanctions because we need to rebuild. And the longer his government stays without any money or the ability to rebuild and with sanctions on it, he will become very unpopular himself, unless he can swing into action and bring some money to play, because Syrians are down. And as you said, 90% are living below the poverty line.
And Joshua, what about Syria's key allies? I mean, you touched on them briefly, Russia and Iran. There are reports that Iran's proxy Hezbollah, they pulled out their forces along the Lebanese border. Russia seems to be looking for a diplomatic solution here, perhaps an off-ramp. I mean, effectively, they abandoned Assad, didn't they? Why?
Well, I think, as the Russians said, we cannot fight for Syria if the Syrian army is not willing to fight. I think that both of them are going to be licking their wounds. They did not want to abandon Assad. I think they felt, in many ways, abandoned by him themselves, because he wasn't fighting. He didn't rally his troops. He couldn't speak to his people. He had a tin ear, and he didn't make any adjustments. The Russians kept on begging him to speak to the Turks and speak to Erdogan and meet with them. He refused, said not until Turkey withdraws all of Syrian troops. He should have talked to the Kurds. The Kurds made a number of advances to him, trying to come up with a deal for some sort of autonomy. He refused it. He was extremely arrogant, and while the opposition was really changing itself and making allies with Turkey, reaching out to the world, assuring Christians, dividing the loyalists to the Assad by hiving off first the Druze, then reassuring the Christians. He's taken over the Ismaili towns and shown that they're safe. And that's been very deftly done on his part, whereas Assad has done almost nothing to build new allies.
Joshua, you're there in Oklahoma City. So what about the U.S. position here? And as we near the transition of power in Washington next month, I mean, Donald Trump has already said, look, the U.S. should not be involved in the Syrian conflict.
Yes, he has. Now, does that include giving back the oil to Jolani, or is he going to keep it for the Kurds? Is he going to keep some position? And I'm sure his new administration is going to be very torn about this. And then the question is, do you lift sanctions, or do you keep them there to have some kind of leverage and say, well, this regime has to behave in a certain sort of way, otherwise it won't get back, it won't have sanctions lifted. And America still has the major party, the major rebel party, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, designated as a terrorist organization. They have $10 million on the head of what will become the new leader of Syria, al-Jolani. So America has to, and Europe, both have to sit down and decide, is this a clean slate? Do we lift all these sanctions, give back the oil, which means abandoning the Kurds as well? Or do we withhold all these and see if they're behave themselves?
Yeah, and that's a whole new dynamic, Joshua. I mean, look, let's remind our viewers there, because it's always easy in any kind of asymmetric conflict for opposition forces to fight and liberate areas, as we've seen in Syria. But the opposition, of course, will need to unite to rebuild Syria once the fighting stops. How much of a challenge is that going to be?
It's going to be a big challenge. And the rebels have not yet penetrated into the coastal regions where all the Alawites live and are in extreme anxiety and fear. They believe, and many do believe, that there's going to be a lot of revenge against them, and that it's not going to be an orderly change of power. And we saw this, when the Americans and the Free French moved back into France, the numbers are like 30 to 40,000 French people were killed, and vigilante collaborators were killed. We're going to see what kind of justice is meted out, and that will be a real test for al-Jolani and his rebels to see whether he can control that process. Because if it is very bloody, chances are sanctions will drag on, and European powers will be loath to just embrace this new government, and they'll want to see how they treat women and how they treat minorities and so forth. There's a big question mark. And of course, Israel is sitting there very relieved that Iran no longer has access to Syria, that it can't send weapons to Hezbollah anymore through Syria, which is the only way to get them to Hezbollah. But it's, of course, Israel's going to be anxious that Turkey is going to have all this influence, that Islamists are now at its border. So already the fears will begin to mount amongst Israel, and Israel has a great deal of influence in the United States, in the Congress, and of course, with the president, the incoming President Trump, as well as it did with Biden. So all of those are going to be new pressures on this regime, which is trying to rebuild and consolidate.
Joshua, just a final thought to you. It's a broader geopolitical thing. All right, so Damascus has fallen. It's the end of the Assad regime. How does this all change? And you touched on it briefly there. How does it change the balance of power regionally? And how much of a major blow is this to Iran and its influence across the region?
Oh, it's a major blow. What was called the Shiite Crescent, and that's the allied governments of Lebanon, where Hezbollah was the dominant power, Shiites, Assad and the Alawites of Syria, who are heterodox Shiites, Iraq, which of course is ruled by Shiites, and Iran. And those four countries in alliance could put pressure on Israel with the access of resistance. And of course, this upset Sunni powers throughout the Middle East, both in the Gulf countries and in Turkey, who supported the rebels and tried to overthrow the Assad regime and to cut this Shiite crescent in half. Now they have accomplished that task. But of course, Erdogan and Turkey are going to be the real winners here. And Erdogan is going to be the new arbitrator in a Syria that will be very dependent on Turkey, as it is for all of its arms and everything else. So that's going to, of course, make Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arabs worried. There will be a new dynamic here. Lebanon will become in play because as Hezbollah's power crumbles, the new government in Damascus and the Turks will look to help this Sunni Lebanese really consolidate their power and build up a new Lebanese army that's dominated by the Sunni Lebanese. So there's going to be a lot of changes as the dust settles here, because Damascus, for the last 55 years, has been ruled by Alawites who've been allied with Iran. Now it's going to be once again in the hands of Sunni Arabs, and it's going to be allied with Turkey, and the Sunni governments in both the Gulf and in Turkey are going to be vying for influence in Damascus.
Joshua Landis, always good to get your thoughts and your analysis on these big developing stories. Joshua, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.